So thank you, Kendra and Dominic, for helping. So my name is Patrick Aaronsberg. I'm director of the Office for Evangelization and Family Life in the Archdiocese. I taught at McGill-Toolen for like 18 years. I started when I was 12, and I taught at Montgomery Catholic for a year before that, and I've been in this office for 7 years. And one of the things that became really clear to me working with high school age young men and women is that we ask people to believe that somebody died on the cross for them. And if you don't believe that you're worth, it's so sad how many parents don't talk to their kids, how many students, hello, just don't feel at all appreciated or like they're at all worthwhile. And if I don't believe I have any worth, then that is incomprehensible. The crucifixion, somebody loving that much, is incomprehensible. So it seems to me, in a lot of ways, a prerequisite for the gospel is an adequate anthropology, an adequate understanding of how good we are and why God made us male and female. And so to that end, about 7 years ago, we started a program that we called Pure and Simple. And it is really just simple, and it's about purity. It's not, I think the most common comment I get from parents, they love it, but they thought it was going to be like a sex ed evening. And I don't think sex comes up other than in the sense of gender, that God made us male and female. Because I think when you understand why God made us male and female, everything else just follows intuitively. So about the evening goes, we start with Mass at 5:30, a quick supper at 6. About 6:20, someone will give a talk on an introduction to what John Paul II would call an adequate anthropology from Theology of the Body, but it's a very inadequate anthropology because we only have like 35, 40 minutes. So it's just kind of an introduction to how God made us. It's a look at Genesis 1 and a brief look at Genesis 2, like super brief. And then the parents stay with the adult presenter, the older adult presenter, and the girls go with a young lady and the guys go with one of the young men for like 45 minutes to then talk about some of the challenges to masculinity, some of the challenges to femininity in our culture and how to deal with them. So that's what the evening is. The way it's structured, before you leave, I would ask you just to sign your name, cell number, and email on that white piece of paper. And several weeks in advance of one of the Pure and Simples coming up, I think I have 6 or 7 in Mobile between January and May. So I'll just send out a GroupMe. I'll add you guys to a GroupMe list, and I'll just send out, January 13th, St. Mary Parish in Midtown Mobile at 6 o'clock or 5:30, whatever, Pure and Simple. And just the first guy to respond that, yeah, I can do it, or the first girl to respond, then we've got our 2. So there's no pressure. You don't reply. I just presume you've got a test, or maybe you're trying to work on your ping pong game, so you're up here working on that some. So you're not obligating yourself to anything right off the bat, but we need help. I mean, there are kids who, you guys have a commodity that I have long since run out of, and it's called youth. And you can relate, the very fact that you're on a college campus, the very fact that you're a college-age man, a college-age woman, makes you just almost godlike in these middle schoolers' eyes. And so I'm just asking you to parlay that into helping with these presentations. They're for middle schoolers and their parents. We asked the parish that you should consider it a volunteer effort, but we do ask the parishes to have a gift card for you all, and when they don't, I make sure my office gets them, so you have like a $25 gift card to, like the Bass Pro Shop, which is probably where you spend most of your time, and, Bed Bath & Beyond for some of you guys. So they have gift cards from various places, Food Faculties or whatever. So that's kind of how it's laid out. Do you have any questions before? That's really, when I ask you for questions, that's really just my way of saying, I want to take a sip of coffee. And instead of there being awkward silence, are there questions? And then I take a sip. So, all right. So when we do these things, you represent the Archdiocese. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time. By the way, we're recording That's why Dominic is hamming it up. Because for people who couldn't make it to one of these, maybe they could, we'll have these available on YouTube. And I know there's at least one person who can't be here this evening, but if y'all come across other folks, we'd love to hear from them. But what I want to do is I want to do about 10 or 15 minutes at the most on just the basics of what it means to be Christian, because it's, in my experience working with a lot of young people, I've prepped a lot of couples for marriage, and you'd be amazed and shocked at how little people know. So I want to just hit the very basics of Catholicism to make sure we all understand. And then I want to talk about sacraments and grace. And then we're going to look at kind of the theology of the body part itself. Okay? All right, so I forgot my glasses, so I'm just going to tell you what the Bible says. So in the book of Genesis, it's striking to me in Genesis chapter 1 that every day when God creates, at the end of the day, he says, he looks at everything he created and he found it to be good. And he says that virtually every day, evening comes, morning follows, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, etc. Well, on day 6, he creates and he finds what he created to be good. But then he creates some more. He creates one more thing, and the one more thing that he creates is humanity. And after he creates humanity, God looks at everything he created and he found it to be very good. Now there's a real difference between good and very good, and I find it kind of startling as a theologian that he's not just saying that we're very good, but when you read Genesis chapter 1, I invite you to pray on that over the next couple days, maybe leading up to Christmas. Our entrance into creation doesn't just make us very good. All of creation is transformed because of our very goodness. And if you grew up Catholic, you hopefully will be sitting there thinking, kind of no duh. But I did a parish mission in Troy, Alabama. Were you in Troy? It was before you got there. It was like 4 years ago, maybe. Father Irwin asked me to come do a thing. And I did an expose, kind of an exegesis on Genesis. And Sarah Talbot brought several young folks from Troy's campus for the 3 evenings of talks. And they agreed and had no problem with everything I said. All these other girls were Protestants. But the one thing that they could not wrap their minds around was the notion that we are good. Like to a lot of Protestants, the notion that we're good is completely backwards. Martin Luther used this analogy. Martin Luther said, imagine a field with horses and cows and, and they, are kind of, they dung all around the place. Can you make dung a verb? It is now. All right, so, they poop all over the pasture. But then God's grace comes and it's snow. And so when you step outside, it's beautiful and pristine, but really underneath it is cow dung. And that's Martin Luther, who's one of the leading intellectual lights of the Reformation. That was his view of humanity, is that we are dung. We are full of filth and corruption at our core. That's what we are. But God's grace covers us. That is so contrary to the Catholic view of humanity. Catholic view is really the opposite of that. It's kind of like, we are the pristine onto which the animals have dunged, because it's a verb, all right? And so, we are clean and pristine. So we kind of arrive at the same point in a lot of ways, but to the Catholics, we are at our core good, but we have allowed ourselves to make filthy choices. We have become soiled. But that's why Jesus comes and he invites us, and this is what I don't really understand about Martin Luther, is how he can hold that position given what Christ says about washing ourselves clean in the blood of the Lamb, that we're going to become completely spotless. Revelation 21:27 says nothing unclean can enter into heaven. It doesn't say that, it can come in as long as it's covered up. That's not what the scriptures say. You have to become perfectly clean to come into heaven. So it's very important for us to understand that at our core, at our beginning, we are very good. And that comes by virtue of the fact that we're made in God's image and likeness. And because it comes that way, it means we can never lose it. So when we sin as Catholics, we believe that we never change from being beautiful and being in God's image and likeness. We distort that image. We dungify, because now it's an adverb. We dungify that image, but at core, it doesn't change. What changes when we sin is our capacity to love God in return. Our sin does not affect God's ability to love us. God continues to see us because our dignity comes not from what we do. Our dignity comes from the fact that we're made in God's image and likeness. Everything that happens after that, while relevant in a certain sense, is not relevant to our dignity and value. Does that make sense? So, my son wrecked my truck a few weeks ago, but we're not going to talk about that tonight. So I have a new used truck, and it's a Ford, right? And it's got a blue oval on the front. It says Ford. If I went out and took that off and put on a Chevy bow tie, does it become a Chevrolet? No, why not? It looks like a Chevrolet. What if I replace all the things that say Ford on it with Chevy bow ties? Now it's a Chevy. Right? Of course not, because it's a Ford Y. Tell me your first name. I'm sorry, I didn't get to. Randy. JP2, where's that?
It's up in Huntsville.
Okay. So, I don't remember my question, but maybe you do.
So why is it
Yeah, why is it a Ford?
because it's made by Ford?
Because it was made a Ford. When it rolled off the assembly line, it was a Ford. No matter what I do, if I try to change the distributor cap or put new spark plugs or whatever, I better buy a part that's going to fit a Ford, not necessarily a Chevrolet. Because it's made a Ford, it will always be a Ford, because by its very making of it, it was a Ford. Same with us. By the very making of us, we're made in God's image and likeness. We can put stuff on top of that. We can hide the image. We can cover the image. But at the core is always the image. We can make ourselves incapable of loving God in return. That's what sin does. Sin teaches us to love other things and ourselves more than God. So it can certainly be the case that we don't go to heaven. But even if God allows us to go to hell, he still sees a reflection of his image and likeness when he looks at us. Nothing we do can take that away. And I think that our middle school kids really need to hear that your sin has not changed God toward you. It's only changed you toward God. And you can restore that image by wiping off the stuff that you've piled on top of it. Okay? Questions or comments before we talk about the next part? All right, so we're made good. What happened? The fall. Okay, so in Genesis chapter 3. Now, tell me what you know about the fall. Anything you know about the fall, just throw it out there. Adam and Eve were the culprits. So tell me this about Adam and Eve. Whose fault was it? Let's just be honest. Huh? Were they, what was going on when they fell? Eve had a conversation with the serpent, right? Am I accurate? Mm-hmm. Adam was running with the deer or something. This is so much fun running in the garden. Right? And Eve fell. And then she became like one of the Disney villains. And she goes and she has to trick Adam into eating the apple, right? Wrong. So if you read Genesis chapter 2 and kind of take away the heading that says chapter 3 and just read it as one continuous story. Adam and Eve are walking together in the garden. And this big, scary animal pops up. And we translate it as serpent, but I really think that's a fairly bad translation because it doesn't mean serpent like, a little snake and, hiding in the tree. The Greek translation of it is Leviathan. It's like this big, scary sea monster pops up. So Adam and Eve are bebopping through the garden together. And Leviathan pops up and Adam's like, oh, honey, it's for you. And he stands there and he is AWOL in the presence of Leviathan, and he leaves Eve to have this conversation alone. And if you have any clue about interpersonal relationships, you know this is headed for disaster. This is headed for disaster even before the fall. So Eve is convinced by Leviathan to do something. What's she convinced to do? What's the nature of the temptation? Do y'all remember? You are so exactly right, but most people don't get that. That's the real temptation. So the first thing that the serpent says to Eve is, did God really tell you you couldn't eat from any of the trees in the garden? Now, do you remember what God's rule actually was? Does anybody remember God's rule? God makes all these awesome trees, and he says, you can eat from any of these trees, Dominic knew. You can eat from any of these trees. There's only 2 trees that you are not supposed to eat from. They're in the center of the garden. Okay? So, the serpent's first trick is what? He misrepresents God's law. Did God tell you you couldn't eat from any of the trees? And Eve had awesome focus missionaries in the garden. So she was well catechized. She knew her stuff. And she said, no, that's not God's law. God's law is we can eat from any tree. It's just the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the center of the garden that we can't eat from. So she understood her faith and was able to correct the serpent. So then the serpent says, you won't die if you eat it. No, God knows that if you eat of the fruit, you will be like gods who know what is good and what is evil. Now, a lot of times people think of Adam and Eve, and they think that God sort of overreacted, right? I mean, think of my son. Let's say when he was 5 years old, he would always get into the birthday cakes. No matter whose birthday it was, like we'd find these little marks in the cake. So I want you to imagine that my wife made this delicious cake. And she brought him in and said, Patrick, come here. You see this cake? Yeah, smell it. Doesn't it smell good? Oh, yeah. Don't eat it. Don't even touch it, lest you die. Patrick's like, okay. And by the way, Mom and Dad are going shopping. So we leave this kid all alone at home with this cake. We come back and we find it like partially destroyed and chocolate all over Patrick's face. Who's really to blame here? Yeah, the parents, right? And yet, isn't that what God did to Adam and Eve? He puts them in the garden, and they've got this desire for this fruit, and then he's like off walking through the garden, admiring his work, and Adam and Eve are hungry, and they see this fruit, and they like my son with the chocolate cake, right? Now, if I took my son and I threw him physically out of the house and told him he was not to come back in the house again, if you were my neighbors, what would you do? Thank you, please God, somebody would call DHR and say, that nutcase finally cracked. He finally went too far. And yet we accept it from God. What's the deal? What's the difference between the two? You had my brother in religion class. Come on, let's see what he got you. Adam is an adult. Adam is an adult.
And he has given a mission.
Say that again?
He's given a mission.
He's been given a mission? Okay, gotcha.
Maybe, yeah. He runs away. What an idiot. I'm just kidding, I've done that. So that would be my guess.
He gave him a ton of other stuff. Plenty of things that were perfectly fine that he could have eaten.
Look, there are Pringles, Doritos, Swiss cake rolls, all kind of food in the house. There were plenty of things for that little rugrat. So I think we look back, and look, y'all, this is a pretty fundamental thing, right? This is, a neighbor of mine is a philosopher at Spring Hill College. Shame we don't have a Catholic college here in Mobile. Yes, I said that on air. And this is his biggest hang up with Christianity. He's like, there's no way This story makes no sense. And I think it makes no sense because we don't understand that you and I have a fallen nature. So the human person is made of body and soul. We're the world's first hybrid. We're physical and spiritual. And we have this rupture between the two. The two are, as St. Paul says, at war with one another in a lot of ways. In the garden, that was not the case with Adam and Eve. They had perfect integration of their body and soul. We're going to look at that some when we look at the theology of the body, but this is why Adam is able to look at Eve, and instead of lusting after her, he says, this one at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman. Because when he looks at Eve, he sees her in her totality, not just her physicality. And so they don't have this rupturedness. The other thing they don't have is something called concupiscence. Concupiscence is this orientation towards sin. We all have passions. Are passions good or are they bad?
They're good.
So I would say they're at least neutral, but I would tend to, if I'd argue it in a thesis, I'd say they're good. They've become twisted in us. Like we can have disordered desires. Bring me a half gallon of Blue Bell and a spoon, and I will show you some disordered desire. Right? I have a desire that is not ordered, like using some very specific language, it's not ordered to my health. If I eat that whole half gallon, oh, that'd be pretty awesome. If I eat that whole half gallon, it'd be really bad for me. It'd be bad for my cholesterol. It'd be bad for my body fat index. It would be bad for all kinds of things, and yet I can desire it. See, I have the capacity to desire things that are not oriented toward my good. We all have those desires, right? Adam and Eve did not have those physical desires. Adam and Eve did not desire that fruit because they were hungry. Adam and Eve did not desire the fruit in any way, shape, or form other than as the means to an end. What they actually desired was exactly what you said. Their temptation was to be like gods. Their temptation was to reject God. Satan essentially placed before them, God told you that he's your loving father. God told you that he's looking out for you, for what's best for you. I'm telling you, he's a lying, maniacal dictator. I'm telling you, he's trying to keep you down. He's trying to not let you elevate yourself. He's trying to keep something away from you that's going to make you better. That's who God is. When Adam and Eve grasped for that fruit, they weren't grasping for a piece of fruit. They were rejecting God. They were rejecting relationship with God. They were rejecting his fatherhood. There was an absolute rupture between them and God, and thus an absolute rupture with themselves. Does that make sense? It is a huge, cataclysmic, literally earth-shattering event that happens in human history. And Adam and Eve's nature, because of that, it essentially changes on the spot. And we are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. We're the descendants. We've received that fallen nature. So we were created good, and then we fell. Okay? Any questions so far? This can be conversational. I don't want it to be a monologue.
I just thought you dialogue for a second.
All right, so that brings us to then, how do we get fixed? How do we get fixed? Well, you're close. That's a more specific answer, but
The snow's got to fall, right?
the snow's got to fall.
Right.
Somebody's got to. But where does the snow come from?
If we clap our hands more and sing songs that make us feel good, then the snow will fall.
You were not beat enough as a child.
Oh my gosh, this is the second time today.
How are we saved? Through Christ. All right, so let me ask you this. What is Jesus? So we all know the catechetical formulation, right? How many persons was Jesus?
3.
No, not just Jesus, sweetheart.
Sorry.
No.
God.
Keep going down.
He's 2.
Nope.
It's wrong.
He's one. Jesus is one. He's a divine person.
3, 2, 1. 1.
There it is. 3, 2,
Trinity
1.
and Jesus.
Yeah, 3 persons of the Trinity. But in Jesus, there's one person. How many natures?
2 natures.
There you go.
1 of the third.
We know you knew.
Yeah.
But 1 God.
Okay, so
One
what are
person, 1 person.
one person, one divine person
Yes.
in 2 natures? What are his 2 natures?
He's like half God, half man.
No, my God. If you guys want to move so the lightning doesn't catch you in the crossfire. No, he's not 50-50. He's 100% human and he's 100% divine. My question for you is why? Why does God have to be 100? Why did Jesus have to be fully human and fully divine? Why couldn't we have just selected the most awesome human person ever and had him be sacrificed to God on behalf of Adam and Eve?
So he could die on the cross. Because then he made
Okay, why couldn't we just select like, Brett Kavanaugh or something? I don't know why that name popped in my head, but there he is. Donald Trump. Why don't we just pick some guy? Why did it have to be God? Why did it have to be God?
Because he's the one that loved him.
Yes, he does, but couldn't like some other human have loved humanity, like the Dalai Lama or something?
Sinned against him.
Okay. Yeah. So 2 things. We sinned against God. Look, who you offend affects the offense. Who you offend affects the offense. So, if I make a bodily threat to you, okay? Who's going to investigate that threat? Let's say it's credible. Like I'm really threatening to do physical harm in a loving Christian way to Philip. The local police, right? Now, if I make a threat against the governor of Alabama, who's going to investigate that threat?
Yeah, that might even go as high as it is, yeah. But
The state police or the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. If I make a threat against the President of the United States, who investigates that? FBI, Secret Service, whatever. But see, because who I'm threatening, who I offend against, affects the nature of the crime. They're different. Even though every human has the same value and the same dignity, there are different penalties for harming the president versus the governor versus a common citizen because of their role. All right. So who you offend affects the offense. Adam and Eve sinned against God. And because we sinned against God, the offense that was offered was infinite. And so the only one that could make a sacrifice to God that was worthy of God was God. I could offer everything I have, and as awesome as that is, because a human person is pretty awesome, as awesome as that is, it is way short of being worthy of God. And so Jesus, the Messiah, the one who redeems us, had to be God. That makes sense? That why did he have to be human? So, you're exactly right.
Human has to make up for it.
Yeah, it was, the debt was owed by humanity. So when he died on that cross, and if there's another cross, I'm just not seeing it, so we're just going to go with the brown ones. Okay? When he died on that cross, it was God being offered to God. But when he died on that cross, it was a human man. It was a human, not a human person. It was a divine person. But it was a man who died on that cross. A human paid the price. So it was precisely in the incarnation with Jesus, who's fully God and fully human. When he died on the cross, it was a sacrifice that was efficacious because he was God, but it counted on our ledger because it was a man who died. That's why the incarnation, that's the heart of our Christian faith. That's the heart of our Christian faith. Okay? Questions?
just can't help but feel like going, hell yeah, congrats.
Heck yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Like what shocks me is how many people don't know it.
Yeah.
You kind of half know it. We kind of, but this is what we believe. Then, further, we believe, and this is where we really begin to diverge from our Protestant brothers and sisters, is that Christ founded a church precisely to carry on the work of salvation. And so we come back to your exactly correct answer from a few minutes ago, through the sacraments. So Christ gives us a church. He gives a church because that's just how he rolls. I mean, look at the Old Testament. He always had a people. There was the chosen people, and everything happened within that chosen people, and that chosen people today is called the Catholic Church. So he founds a church, and he gives the church the graces of salvation. So the graces are mediated through the church, specifically through the sacraments. So I think it's important for us to understand, because we should always, when we're working with kids, invite them to Christ in the Eucharist, invite them to Christ in the sacrament of reconciliation. Those are the big two that they can encounter very regularly in their lives. This is what the church teaches about sacraments. That the normal way that God mediates his grace to humanity, the normal way that God gives us his grace, is through the sacraments. That's the normal way. But we also believe as Catholics that it's not the only way. That God can give his grace outside of the sacraments. But it's not the norm. The way we know that is in Luke's gospel, I don't know, probably around chapter 23. Jesus is well, let's go back to John 3. John 3. In John 3, Nicodemus comes and is talking to Jesus about baptism, about being born again. And Jesus tells him you have to be born again to enter to the kingdom. And Nicodemus says, can a man once grown old crawl back into his mother's womb and be born again? He can't do that, can he? And Jesus says you have to be born of water and the Spirit to enter into the kingdom of heaven. He's talking about baptism. He doesn't equivocate. He doesn't give caveat. He doesn't give, you have to be born again to go to heaven, period. That's the end of his sentence. Then in Luke 23, Jesus is dying on the cross, and the good thief says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. You remember that? So you remember then Jesus rips one hand free from the cross. He grabs some water, throws it on the good thief, and says, I baptize you. Because you can't go to heaven if you're not baptized. Remember that? No? Because it didn't happen. So he's died on the cross, and this good thief, the thief says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. And I'm like, wait. Right here, Lord, you said that you had to be born again of water and the Spirit to go to heaven. Do you remember saying that? Gotcha, Lord. So clearly, people can be credited with this. People can be given sacramental grace outside of the sacrament. You follow? So clearly that can happen. I'll tell you a quick story. There was a young lady who, when I taught at McGill, for some reason, this friend of mine, my friends would give me these weird books. Like I had a friend, God rest him, he was a priest who died a few years ago. He and I were in seminary together. And every year when final exam week hit, he would leave at my door either an anthology of Calvin and Hobbes or of the Far Side or something, knowing that I couldn't put it down and I would struggle through exam week. It was awful. Well, another guy gave me this book called The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing His Hands. It was about obsessive compulsive disorder. Anyway, so I just finished reading this book, and I was teaching at McGill, and there was this young lady, and she, at the end of my class, she would get up, and she'd like move the desk in front of her out, and she would walk back and forth from her desk like 5 times, and then she would pick up her book bag and go to the next class. And I thought, well, that's a little odd, but, you know, whatever, maybe. So one day after class, I called her and said, hey, what are you doing? And she said, I think I might have left something. I said, well, I'll tell you what, I want you to leave right now. This is before she did her 5 times. I want you to leave right now. I'll check. If I find anything, I'll bring it to your class. And she gave me this look that haunts me. She was such a good kid, and she wanted to do what I told her to do, but she couldn't. She had to do her little routine. So long story short, we got the guidance counselors. We called her mom in. There was family trauma, all kinds of stuff. So they pulled her out of McGill, and there used to be this place called Arnold Academy in Mobile. It's a place where you could get your academics, but it was like all the kids who got kicked out of public school. It was awful. But it was kind of like homeschool, like you would just take your assignments in. So she was gonna keep up her classes through Arnold, but she needed religion class. So once a week, her mom would bring her up, and I would give her a segment of the catechism to read. When she would come in, we'd talk for about 45 minutes with her mom there, and then I'd give her next week assignment. At the end of the semester, I gave her a B or something. I mean, she knew the material really well, but I didn't make her take any quizzes or tests or write any papers. What's the normal way to get a grade in my class at McGill? Take tests and quizzes, come to class every day, do all that, all the typical stuff. Is it the only way to get credit?
No.
Apparently not. I mean, this young lady, right? But how foolhardy would it be for somebody to hear that story and go, sweet, I don't have to go to Mr. Ernstberg's class anymore. At the end of the semester, I'll just go, hey, can we talk? I'll read the catechism, we'll have some coffee, right? Be foolhardy, right? So we should never be presumptuous that God will work outside of the sacraments, but he can. And this is why the church teaches that people who are not Christian can possibly be saved and go to heaven. That's very unusual among Christian sects. Most Christians think, no, you're not baptized. I mean, it's pretty clear in John 3. If you're not baptized, you cannot go to heaven. If you're not born again, you're not going to heaven. We believe, well, yeah, that's true. If you're not born again, you're not going to heaven. But God can actualize that grace even if the sacrament doesn't occur. You follow? Other thing I think it's important for you guys to know about sacraments is that we believe that the sacraments actually cause the grace they symbolize. For a lot of our non-Catholic brothers and sisters, baptism is nothing. It doesn't really exist. They accept Christ as their Lord and Savior, and then they do a baptism, but it really only symbolizes the interior reality that already occurred. What's happening in the river or wherever they do the ceremony is meaningless. It's just symbolic. For Catholics, we believe that the sacraments absolutely are symbolic. The Eucharist should remind us of being nourished, should remind us of being inebriated in love. Baptism should remind us of being washed clean, of dying and being resurrected. All of those symbols are true and accurate. The difference is, in the Catholic faith, we believe that they're symbolic, but they're also efficaciously symbolic. So the phrase used in Catholic theology is that they're efficacious symbols. All right, now we've just done everything there is to know about being Catholic in 38 minutes. So questions or comments? How many of you went to Catholic high schools? So how much, percentage-wise, was this kind of new to you? Some of the, any percentages? Just throw out a number.
25, 50.
Okay. How about the non-Catholic school crowd?
I'll say about the same.
Okay.
There's format really well done.
Okay, any questions or comments? Kendra? You want to add anything?
I think my only question is how does everything that you've talked about then play into pure and simple and short?
It doesn't. Other than it, when we're going to put somebody into a room that represents the archdiocese, I need to know that they have a grounding in the basic theology of the church, just a basic understanding of what the sacraments are, who Jesus is, who we are, how we fell. Because otherwise you become just robots and you can only answer certain questions. I want there to be more formation than that. So that's how it fits in that. Okay. Because God only knows what 8th graders are going to ask you. I could be teaching on Why does the Pope wear white in my religion class? Is oral sex wrong? Not sure how you got there from here. I mean, so just to kind of be able to answer questions that they're throwing at you. That question you would just duck. We'll get to that later. Okay? All right, so now let's kind of look at what we would call the theology of the body, why God made us male and female. As you go back through the creation stories, it's very, very interesting that God in Genesis chapter 1 says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion. And it's pretty instructive to me that God only gives one rule. The only rule he gives Adam and Eve in the garden is be fertile and multiply. That if you understand why I made you male and female, everything else will fall into place. You know, when you're 5, you probably have 286 rules. You can't cross the street. You got to look both ways if you do. You can't do that. I mean, the list of rules is, and when you go off to college, it's like, all right, be careful, sweetheart. Make good decisions. It was like one rule. Because the more mature you are, the fewer rules you need. Adam and Eve got one rule, and it pertained to their identity as male and female. I find it also really interesting, and I'm sorry, my Bible is totally beaten up. It's pretty old, older than me. That in Genesis chapter 1, it's like page 1 of the Bible. And for the next, let's see. (1,052 pages), God is preparing for the coming of Christ. Like this is the Old Testament, this is the New. Right here you put Jesus. So everything in the Old Testament looks forward to Christ. Everything in the New Testament is reflecting on Christ's coming. But right here, so everything that happens here is God preparing his people for the coming of Christ. And one of the things he's got to really root out in the minds and the hearts of his people is the notion that there are a bunch of gods. Because if I don't root out from my people that there are a bunch of gods, what's going to happen when Jesus comes and reveals the Trinity? They're going to think, well, 3 gods, right? They're not going to understand one God, 3 persons. There's no way. So God is persnickety about, you do not intermarry, you do not have anything to do with those people who are polytheistic. They win a battle, he tells them, go kill all of them. Don't marry them, don't bring them into your tents, get rid of them all. Like for 1,052 pages. And yet here on the very first page of the Bible, what does he say? Let us make man in our image and our likeness. Like, wait, what are you doing? You're going to confuse people. So it must be pretty important that he reveals to us right off the bat that we're made in the image and likeness of the Trinity. It is not the case that you're made in the image and likeness of God the Father. That's not really accurate. It's not really accurate to say that you're made in the image and likeness of God the Son. And it's not really accurate to say that you're made in the image of the Holy Spirit. Rather, you're made in the image and likeness of the Trinity. 3 persons in one divine entity. That God the Father from all eternity loved God the Son and made a gift of his very self to the Son. And the Son receives the gift of the Father and returns the gift of his very self. And the love between the Father and the Son is so real and so profound and so dynamic that it is a third person, namely the Holy Spirit. That's what the Trinity is. And that's the image that we're made in. We're not made to be in isolation. And in fact, God makes us male and female precisely so that he can make present the image of the Trinity in the world. That when we see a husband and a wife, when we see a family, we should see an image of the Trinity. Because in marriage, a man makes a gift of himself to his wife, and the wife receives the gift of her husband, and the love between the husband and the wife is so real and so profound and so dynamic that it may be a third person, namely a baby. So God makes us male and female precisely so that he can make present the image of the Trinity. That marriage itself is what John Paul II would call an icon of the Blessed Trinity. You follow? So this is how we're made. We're made to give ourselves away. We're made to receive the other in authentic love. That's how we're hardwired to be. Our culture tells us that what's going to make us happy is to have lots of stuff, even if we have to use people, that the more we have, the happier we'll be. The rules of the culture are do unto others before they do unto you, and he who dies with the most toys wins. Okay, I'm willing to play that game, but the reality is that that never makes us happy. That the more I have, the more unhappy I become. That our culture, in the history of the universe, the history of the world, of all times, of all places, nobody has been as wealthy as we are right now. With as much leisure time, with as much stuff, with boats and second houses and entertainment, and we're just dripping with wealth. We don't worry where our next meal is going to come from. Not even close to it. And so this culture that tells us the more we have, the happier we'll be, let's put it to the test. We should be the happiest people ever. This culture, if having stuff is going to make us happy, we should be super happy. Doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, we can't turn on the TV without some mass shooting somewhere. Somebody getting mad on the interstate and having some road rage incident. It's just crazy how unhappy we are. And so I look and say, well, gosh, I'm not so sure that the culture's defining of who we are and what's going to make us happy seems to fit the reality. Put theology aside, it just doesn't seem to fit reality. It doesn't seem to square with what I observe. If we're made to give ourselves away, however, that's what the Bible tells us. Let's put that to the test. How many of you ever volunteered? Have you ever spent a day at a nursing home or Habitat for Humanity or 2 whole years in Focus? Right? If our culture is right, at the end of a day of volunteering or a year of volunteering, you should be royally miffed. Because you spent your whole day working in that nursing home and you got nothing out of it. You should be miserable, angry, and unhappy. And yet, doggone it, when we do stuff like that, how do we feel? Joyful, happy, all kinds of... How does that doesn't make any sense if the culture is right. So that seems to me pretty indicative that this is in fact how we're made. We're made to give ourselves away in authentic love. Now, we don't get into contraception because we're talking to 8th graders, for crying out loud. But just, because someday you guys are going to be getting married. So kind of in the distant preparation for marriage, this is why the church teaches what it teaches about contraception. Like, it drives me nuts because I think most people think that contraception is about, well, you know what, you're supposed to have as many babies as you can. That's not what the church teaches. What the church teaches is you should never withhold part of the gift. That when a husband loves his wife, he should make a gift of his entire self to his wife and not hold part of himself back. And the wife, when she makes a gift of herself, should make a gift of herself in her totality and not hold anything back or attack part of the gift that her husband is bringing. And he shouldn't attack any part. I mean, that the problem with contraception is not that it contracepts. That's a symptom. The problem with contraception is it violates the gift. Instead of the body being a gift, it becomes a lie. It becomes a withholding, and that's the problem. And because that love is then infected, or because it's so diminished, it becomes incapable of bringing new life. So it's almost like the contraceptive is a consequence, not the cause. You follow? So if we're made in the image and likeness of the Trinity, and God makes us male and female precisely to give ourselves away in love, that's the reality of the human person. Questions or comments? Have you guys heard all that before? I mean,
Wait, so the problem with it is like not exactly how
No, it's precisely how it works. But what I'm saying is that people tend to focus on what's wrong with it is it prevents you from getting pregnant. And that's not the problem with it. The problem is that it's a violation of the gift of self. And the consequence of that is it renders the act infertile.
Because the opportunity to like get life is part of that total gift of self. You're like stopping that.
Look, love,
Well, I was like thinking more so like the abortion aspect.
in a certain sense, so I would say in a certain sense, abortion has nothing to do with sex. I mean, obviously it does, but in terms of its moral problem is that it's attacking a human life. Every human life came from a sexual act. Whether it's in the womb or outside of the womb, the problem with the act is that you're killing a human person. That's the problem with abortion. It's not really tied to that gift of self between a man and a woman. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but isn't that also the problem with contraception?
No. Problem with contraception is completely different.
Maybe like there's like the morning after pill and everything.
Yeah, because it like prevents the embryo from like, so it's like essentially the embryo just has to die because it can't like.
Okay, so there are multiple contraceptives, right? There are prophylactics that stop the sperm and the egg from meeting. There's a spermicide, which attacks and kills the sperm. There is things like the IUD that make it impossible, and it's abortifacient because it makes it impossible for the fertilized egg, now an embryo, aka human person, from implanting in the uterus, and so it simply vacates the body, and it's a spontaneous abortion, although she doesn't even realize it's happened. And then there are chemical birth control pills that have several effects that make it unlikely for fertilization to occur. But even when fertilization occurs, it makes it less likely that the embryo will implant and survive. So that too can be abortifacient. But those are wrong even before it gets to that abortifacient dimension of it, because it's a withholding of the gift. It's a violation of the gift itself. Okay? And a whole other point I wanted to talk about, but I can't remember it now. So other questions, hopefully it'll come back into the head in a little bit.
What was that other point that you wanted to do?
I don't know, it had to do with gift of self, but I don't remember what it was. All right, let me look at Genesis and see if it pops back into my head. Okay, so while we're waiting for that to come back, so the second thing to notice, and we talked about this briefly, it's very interesting. The second story of creation with Adam and Eve. In the second story of creation, Adam already exists, and God brings him different animals, and none of them prove to be a suitable partner. So he casts a deep sleep onto Adam. And in his sleep, God takes from his side the rib. And by the way, are you guys good at reading the Bible, like with looking at the parallels between the Old and the New Testament? Can you think of another time when somebody had a deep sleep cast upon them, and then their side was opened, and they gave birth to something? In the case of Adam, he gave birth to Eve. Can you think of anyone else who had their side opened and from it came forth something alive? He might have been dying on the cross at the time, maybe.
I was really holding out to see if you were
Right? There's a real parallel between Adam and his bride coming forth from his side when he's in this deep sleep, and Christ, whose bride comes forth from his side, namely the church. And in fact, if you look at Genesis and Revelation, there are bookends of the Bible, and you know what's on each end? Marriage. That all of the book of Revelation is a marriage between the Lamb and his bride, the church. Okay, so back to Adam and Eve. He gives a rib, and God builds us up into Eve. Now, Adam, when he wakes up, he's never seen another human person. He's never seen any woman. And he sees a woman, not just a woman, a beautiful woman. And not just a beautiful woman, the most beautiful woman ever next to Our Lady. Because she's not marred with the stain of sin. She's not disfigured. Like we're all disfigured by sin. Eve wasn't disfigured by sin. So Adam wakes up from this, having never seen another human person, having never seen a woman, and there is the perfectly beautiful, most awesome, beautiful woman ever, and she's naked. And Adam's reaction is, oh look, a human person. This one at last is bone of my bones. This one at last is woman. For out of her man this one has been taken. That Adam looks at Eve and he sees her in her totality, body and soul, and he doesn't have the capacity to sort of divide her up and see her as parts for use for his pleasure. He doesn't have that capacity to kind of dissect Eve. But rather he appreciates her, that her body is an icon of the soul, that her body is the visible manifestation of her soul, that her body reveals to Adam the very essence of her personhood. And because of that, they were naked but felt no shame. See, we feel shame because we need to protect ourselves. Imagine my son when he was 5, the UPS guy comes to the door, and my wife's in the shower, I'm at work, and he's like, hey, I need a signature. Oh yeah, come on in. So he comes in and, hello, hello. My wife comes out of the shower, and there's the UPS guy. What's her reaction? No, that's not it. She doesn't start laughing. What's her? She freaks out. How? She screams. So, and in addition to screaming, she probably either runs or even more immediately than runs, because it takes a little while to exit the room. What does she do immediately? She covers. She goes, she covers, right? Is that how she covers? What does she cover? Right? Isn't it interesting that she covers those parts of her body precisely that distinguish her body from a man's body? That what she's seeking to do, without being able to articulate it, is she's attempting to protect her female dignity, her feminine dignity. You know, my mom died essentially of Alzheimer's. She got it very young. She was like 69. I remember she was pretty close to dying, maybe 6-8 months away. She became incontinent, and so she'd poop her pants. And I can remember my dad changing her diaper, and she didn't remember anybody. She didn't know anybody by name. She couldn't talk. She was having trouble swallowing. And so he's like changing her diaper, and she's waylaying on my dad. And he just keeps absorbing the blows. Donna, it's okay. I'm Bud. I'm your husband. I'm here to take care of you. Donna, it's okay. I'm Bud, your husband. It's okay. And I remember, several things struck me in those moments. One was, oh my God. When he stood before the altar and made promises to her, he had no earthly idea that that's what was coming. But that's what we all long for, right? We all long to be loved like that. We all want to know that somebody has our back no matter what. And we'll come back to that. Make sure I come back to that, please, because I'll forget. I'll say, I was going to make another point, and I forgot. Would you please bring me back to that point?
What would the trigger word be?
I don't know. Dominic, please help me. See, I don't know, because I don't remember the point now at this point.
I actually forgot myself.
Yeah, somebody having your back,
Right,
no matter what.
right.
Okay? But the second thing was, it amazed me that even though she couldn't call me by name, she didn't know who my dad was, she still had this hardwired desire to protect her dignity, her femininity, right? That's how we're made. Juxtapose that to, I come home from work and she's in the shower. And she comes out of the shower and there I am, what's her reaction? Hey, hey. You know, so I taught, this is part of morality when I taught it at McGill, because this is anthropology. So I would ask the boys at McGill, so guys, like, what is her reaction when it's me? And high school boys, high school seniors, and you were all there, so was I. What do you think her reaction is when she gets out of the shower and it's me? And they would go, hey. Like, no, not exactly. So the point is that Adam and Eve saw each other and loved each other in totality, and they saw each other as they were and accepted the totality of the other person. St. Augustine says that the deepest longing of the human heart is to be seen as we are and loved. That's our deepest longing. We want to be seen, like all the weird things that we do, all the weird things about us. We wish people would know those things and love us. And we hold back because we're really afraid if we reveal those things, people wouldn't like us much. And we're probably right, because there's some weird things in all of us. But the deepest longing of the human heart is to be seen as we are and loved. And that's why, and that's what, John Paul II says, that, the sexual urge, in and of itself, in its origin, the sexual urge is a longing for communion of persons. Long before it's physical, it's a spiritual longing for communion of persons. Now you add that to 8th grade hormones, and you've got a real problem in terms of desire, because you've got this spiritual longing and then this physical urge that they don't know how to deal with. We're not going to talk about the physical part so much, but we can talk about the spiritual side and encourage greater intimacy with Christ and encourage healthy friendships and healthy relationships and that kind of stuff. But this is how we're made. This is how we're longed. This is what we long for, being accepted. And this is why Christ makes marriage permanent. I think he makes it permanent for a couple of reasons. One, because I want to know that somebody has my back. I want to know that no matter what, somebody's going to be there to take care of me. And the flip side of that is I promise to be there to take care of my wife. That there's a permanence there, that I promise to be there no matter how tough it gets. But the other dimension to the permanence of marriage is it's precisely because my wife can't run away. She's promised me she wouldn't, that I can reveal myself to her, because she's promised no matter what I reveal, no matter how weird it is, she's going to stay. Right? That's the beauty of the permanence of marriage. This is what we all long for, and this is why Christ gives us marriage. Okay? So, questions or comments?
Have you buried that?
Yeah, that's exactly what Dominic did.
Weird guy and he knows it. Anna can't run away now.
Yeah, I often wonder, why did you say yes when I asked a woman? I don't understand, but there she did, and she's locked in.
And the freedom is unreal.
And that's precisely what and there's such a warped sense of freedom in our culture. Like for us, people look at marriage and say, "What about freedom?" Well, it's kind of like saying, "Well, I'm going to go to the buffet, but I'm not going to eat anything, because as soon as I choose to eat these things, then I can't eat these other things because I'll already be full." And so, in the name of freedom, we refuse to exercise our freedom because we're afraid to make a choice. Freely making a choice is the definition of freedom. I freely chose to marry Connie Louise Williams. I chose to make vows to her and to accept vows from her. And it's precisely in that freedom, it's precisely in that locking in together that we exercise our freedom. And it's precisely in the permanence of marriage. And I get so sick. I was a high school football coach for a long time, and I was an offensive coach. I called the plays. I don't like playing defense. I want to play offense. And I'm so sick of that. We're always on defense in the church. Because the only time we talk about the permanence of marriage is when somebody's gotten divorced And now they found the guy they really want to marry. And he's wonderful and he's perfect. And this guy that she married right out of college, I mean, he was awful, he was stupid, everybody told her you shouldn't do this, blah, 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 right? And now she's met, Joe Catholic, and they go to daily mass, and it's so wonderful. And there's only one thing standing between her and happiness: the church. And that's the only time we talk about the permanence of marriage. You know what? Marriage is permanent for our freedom and for our happiness, so that we can reveal ourselves completely to the other. And I tell you all this is happening in our 8th grade kids. This is a human longing. They long to be loved like this, and they seek it in all the wrong places a lot of times. And at the end of the day, and what I talk to the parents about is that if we, and this goes for you, whether you're in 8th grade or whether you're a sophomore or junior at South or whether you're 50 years old, if you want to be chaste and pure, you have got to go to Christ in the Eucharist. And you've got to approach Christ's mercy in the sacrament of penance. Because if our hearts are made, because look, here's the deal. We are made not for this life. We're made to go to heaven. We're made to be taken into the inner life of the Trinity. Your heart is made so that you can come into the inner life of the Trinity and be part of this self-giving and receiving of the other in love. That's what your heart is made for. And so there's this longing for communion with other people. And to that, there's the animal desire for procreation. And you put those two together, it's explosive. And so if we can at least on our spiritual side be filled with healthy communion with Christ and with friends and family, that gives us a chance. That our job then is to direct people who are struggling with chastity to Christ in the Eucharist, to coming into communion, since that's what our hearts are made for. So there. I don't know if I left anything out or not, but I think that's about it. Do you guys have questions or comments? No, I threw it in there. I worked it in about having each other's back. And this is absolutely and definitively countercultural, and it is absolutely and definitively the case that in a lot of ways the church is losing ground with this message. And it's really frustrating because it's sort of like having the greatest product ever. And when people know what the product is, they definitely want it. They definitely want to buy it. And we just keep tripping all over ourselves. This is the truth. I mean, I've never spoken these words to any kid, any young adult, any adult that it did not resonate with. There's a difference between objective and subjective truth. Objective truth just means it's out there, it's true. You're either right or you're wrong. Subjective truth is you determine the truth, like who's the most beautiful, who's the most, and it's like opinion, but it's not technically the same as opinion. The thing about the theology of the body and the things that we've been talking about for the last half hour is that it's an objective truth. This is who God is. This is how your heart's made. But it resonates and it strikes a chord in every human person. So you bring in the most hardened atheist. You bring in somebody who rejects Christ. You bring in somebody who, their hearts, whether they accept it or not, are made in the image and likeness of the Trinity. Their hearts, whether they accept it or not, whether they know it or not, are made for Christ and for love. And when they hear the words of the kingdom, it strikes a chord. Now sometimes that chord comes out as an F you. I mean, it strikes a chord and they become angry because they don't like the chord that's being struck, but it's striking a chord. And in a lot of people, it strikes a chord and it's like, I don't know what you're saying, but tell me more. I mean, I'm telling you that this message, the gospel message, is salvific and it's beautiful, and we should be absolutely unafraid to proclaim this message because it works. It's a product that works. Everybody likes it. It's like Bluebell ice cream, but better. Have you people even had Bluebell since you've been in Mobile? No, you haven't. No, you haven't. Oh, listen. You give me 3 things of Bluebell and tell me that 1 in 3 is going to have the listeria. I'm taking my chances. I'm going to take my. You know, it's funny because I would do classes up in Montgomery. So I was doing this talk kind of like tonight about disordered desires, and I used the analogy of Bluebell. And this is when it was off the shelf. So I was like, I promise you, when they get Bluebell back, you're going to see some disordered desires. And they're like, it's back. I said, no, it's not, because I'd just been in the store the day before. It's back. It was back in Montgomery for like 3 months before we got it in Mobile. So every time I went to Montgomery, I like coolers in my back seat. And I was bringing back Bluebell for the long, cold winter. I'm home. You're like, where's the Bluebell? Yeah, we're happy to see you. Where's the Bluebell? Mm-hmm.
Can you help me out with the car?
Yeah. Well, I didn't start by saying this, but thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you so much for your willingness to help with this. Our kids are so unhappy. You know, my gosh, the enemy is he's so clever. I mean, he's got us all divided because we all got our nose in our phones. He's got us all divided, and he's got us all convinced that we should live for ourselves, and that's going to make us happy. So we're becoming divided and self-indulgent, and we're becoming more deeply and deeply rooted in unhappiness. You know, I always tell the kids when I do Pure and Simple, I want you to be happy. I want you to be happy now. And I just think that living the way the culture tells you to live is going to make you miserable. It's not how your heart's made. I wish it was in some ways. I like being selfish. It's easy. But it's just not how we're made. Do our focus missionaries have any theology to add in? That was kind of all over the place, but
I thought that was so good.
yeah, let me tell you some other good news. That I feel like I'm a pretty small little birthday candle, you know, like that's kind of the light I bring to the world. And in the middle of the day, that little birthday candle doesn't do much. But the darker this culture gets, the more brightly our lights will shine. So don't be afraid of the darkness. Don't be afraid of the fact that the culture is getting darker and darker. It was precisely into the dark culture of the Roman Empire that Christianity exploded. Like, man, we're like burning Christians. You know that during the persecutions of Nero, they soaked Christians in pitch and lit them to light the games of killing other Christians. And it's precisely that culture into which Christianity exploded. I can't wait to see what the Lord has in store for this culture. And you all are going to be the ones that make it happen. Just so you know.
You'll be soaked in pitch, man.
You might be. You might be soaked in pitch.
Yeah, it's not a bad way to go.
So be it.
You know, straight into heaven. So good.
And I've been given a lot of gifts in my life, but sometimes it absolutely blows my mind that Connie has made a gift of her very self, her entire life to me. Oh my gosh, it's better than any video game or any, I mean, what a gift. What an incredible gift. So, yeah, it's a great life. It's a great life.
Oh, and I mean, even the beautiful part of it is.
Well, I'll stay and answer any questions, but I'm going to turn this off.